Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is Listening Beyond the Soundbites. I want to give you a little summary of what this show is all about. We're going to be talking about the unfunded liability for both the state employees and teachers' pensions. And we're going to talk about what does it mean to be underfunded. And we have an expert here with us today who has been talking this story for years, David Coates, who is retired managing partner for KPMG. David, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Pat.
This is a little complicated, this discussion, so pay attention because we're talking big bucks, are we not?
We're talking a lot of big bucks.
Yes, we are. So before we get started, though, we always ask our guests to talk a little bit about themselves.
Well, I'm a Colchester native, been around a long time. I was the former managing partner, and now the former managing partner at KPMG in Burlington. Before that, I ran a small accounting firm, which was the largest in the state, but was small compared to KPMG. And then we had a transaction with KPMG, and they bought us out. Oh. And then I stayed with KPMG until 1993, which seems like a long time ago now, doesn't it?
Exactly.
And then I retired, and then I ran NECI, New England Culinary Institute, for a few years when the owner, the CEO, was ill. And then I moved on, and I ran the Bank of Vermont, Burlington Savings Bank, and Key Bank for interim periods while we were looking for a new CEO. I was chair of the board for most of that period of time.
Wow.
So I've done a lot of things, and I'm on a lot of state boards, it seems like, the bond bank and the debt affordability, and I used to be on the Governor's Council of Economic Advisors, but we don't have one now. So,
that's a good thing to note for
I didn't realize
our upcoming show on economic development or
Sure.
lack thereof.
Right.
So
that's kind of a quick background on me. And I've been involved in this since 2008.
So I'm going to stick it, but why?
Why?
Why is that? You are almost passionate about this.
Well, for me, passion is fishing.
I'm sorry, I apologize.
This is not passion. This I almost
Deep
cringe
interest.
every year I get the actuary's report, just because I know there's more bad news.
Well, maybe we can hit the audience with the bad news.
Well, so we're talking about unfunded liabilities against the Vermont Pension Fund and retirement funds for both teachers and for the state employees.
Yes.
Right. We're looking at last report, so 2017. We're looking at $4.5 billion and climbing. What's in that fund or in that liability?
Let me explain first, if I can.
Sure.
Then about what is an unfunded liability.
Yeah,
Back up a little
really.
Let me back up a
There's a
little
few
bit.
people asking that question.
The unfunded liability is really the gap between what we owe all of the participants in those plans, present value to the present time, using a discount rate, versus how much we have in the bank, so to speak, how much investments we have. So when we put all of those together, we have a $4.5 billion gap between the assets and how much we owe.
And in terms of how much we owe, these are pension dollars that we have promised to state employees and teachers.
These are commitments.
That we've
yes.
committed to. And then when we look at that versus what we've actually got in the bank, and what we need to have in the bank in order to meet those obligations over the next 10, 15, 20 years.
Absolutely.
That's what we're talking about.
Yes, that's
is
exactly
that
what we're
shortfall.
talking
And David, this includes healthcare promises,
yes,
right?
and this is right now. If we
that's
took the
huge.
$4.5 billion, 2.3 is in healthcare,
Yeah.
and 2.2 billion is in employee OPED, is what we call it. But it's
Right.
retiree healthcare benefits, 99% of it.
Wow. I don't know. Well, I told you were invited on because Tom Pelham and I were out for lunch, and he mentioned this to me, and he showed me all the statistics, and I said, I've got to call David Coates, because you have been talking about this for years, and I remember being in House Government Operations when you came in, and you have a slide presentation.
Yes.
And a little bit later on, we've got the statistics of how it's just grown and grown and grown. And you were in 2009, that's as far back as I went, you were on the Commission on the Design, this is a long title, Commission on the Design and Funding of Retirement and Retiree Health Benefit Plans for State Employees and Teachers. and the General Assembly put that together. Did they have a clue at the time that maybe we were in trouble, or?
Well, I had just started taking a position on it. Let me, if I can go back
Yes,
just a
please,
second.
explain what.
It all started when the Vermont Business Roundtable invited the Concord Coalition, which is a group still existing, that looked at mandatory state, and not in this case, federal expenditures. You're looking at Medicare, Social Security, retirement, and they were saying that these mandatory expenditures were actually driving all of the other expenditures down, because they're all of a sudden, and today it's the very same thing. So in response, they had a speaker up. Vermont Business Roundtable asked 3 of us if we would respond from Vermont's perspective. So I said, sure, I'll be happy to do that. And this is when I started, and I said, well, what are our mandatory expenditures? I know there's debt. And what are the other things that are really mandatory, things that we have to have over the course of the year, whether it's human services or all of that. But what really is mandatory? And all of a sudden I stumbled on this, I would say, and I saw the pensions, and I saw the retiree health care benefits, and I said, wow, it wasn't very much at that time. However, it's grown. Over the 5 years I looked at it, it had grown.
It's staggering.
So that kind of started it all, and then I've just followed the bouncing ball, as they say, since then, in all of the actuarial reports.
Well, and one of the things that you wrote about this commission, you said that the commission noted that actuaries estimated that at that time, it would take 20 years at the 2009 current investment rate of return to get back to fiscal year 2000. I mean, that's staggering, and that's 2009.
Right.
20 years.
20 years. However, it's longer than that now.
Oh,
I was going to ask that
would
question
imagine
next.
that.
Where are we at?
And there's a lot of reasons for that, which we can cover as you would like, but it's just a large amount of money, and I think from my perspective, when I look at our state revenues, it's almost 3 times our state revenues now.
Right.
And then the important thing to me, I mentioned I was on the debt affordability, and each year we actually analyze where we are, and then we look at how we are compared to our competitors, if you want to call it, or our peers in the AAA category, to see how much debt that we can issue that we can pay for. And now we're talking about bonded indebtedness of $600 million, and the increase from 2016 to 2017 of the unfunded liability was $900 million. So it's 1.5 times in 1 year.
Wow.
Well, and that's accounting even education funding dollars, which we can kind of argue one way or the other on whether you include education fund dollars, because some of them do pay for teachers' health care.
Yeah.
And whether or not current health care.
And they started a plan, though, just then, where they're now charging the schools for some of the retiree health care benefits.
Yes. Yep. Yeah, which is
for new teachers.
For new teachers.
That's right. That was about a
going
year or
forward.
2 ago they started
Yes.
that. Right?
Yeah, they started rolling that forward.
trying to make up
And that's,
some of
and that's
this.
a good thing, except what we're seeing now, we're pushing it down to the local level, an obligation the state said we'll take care of,
Yeah.
Right.
which was a mistake to begin with.
Which is still, I mean, even at the local level, they're accounting for it on their budgets. They still get 60% of their revenue from the state education fund without impacting their tax rate.
Right.
So, it's still kind of, it's a local liability, but it's still also a state liability.
It pushes it up somewhat, but it will
Right.
be more as we move forward.
And there is a plan in play in the legislature that would take, because currently the healthcare piece is in the education fund.
Yes.
There's discussions about moving the unfunded liability portion of that back into the general fund, because they feel like, some people feel like this is a creation of the legislature, and the legislature would be paying for it, not out of the education
Well,
fund.
when you
One
say
way
the
or another-
legislature will pay for it, you know who that is.
Yeah,
Well,
one way or another,
out of the
Vermonters
general
have to
fund.
pay for it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
one of the point taken, but the education fund is primarily driven off of property taxes.
Right,
That's the
right.
variable in there. So you're asking towns essentially to pay
Right,
for
to pay
it.
for it when they were supposed to be paying for it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
One of there's a whole bunch of talk about this since 2009. We're almost a decade out from that original finding. What has happened? Has there been any changes? I got a list of like 10 things that have been proposed, and I'm not
that's from that
I'm not going to
commission.
read them all
Yeah.
for everyone.
No, I understand.
But has anything been done? Has anything been talked about?
There have been changes. They've They've increased the amount that new employees have to pay into the system.
Right.
They've extended the years in terms of when you can have a normal retirement.
Right.
They've shared the healthcare costs a little bit different. And incidentally, kudos to our treasurer who's done a great job
Yeah.
on the healthcare piece of
Yeah.
this, getting it closer to reality, and it isn't. However, it's just nibbling around the edges. However, the big thing that should have come out of it, actually a couple of big things that should have come out of that commission, which we voted on. One was that we voted not to look at a defined contribution plan and stay with the defined benefit. Now, we took votes on everything, and in the back end of that report, you'll see the votes. There were 7 members on that commission. The governor appointed 2. Jeb Spalding was ex officio. And then we had 1 from the House, 1 from the Senate, 1 from the Education Department, and then the President Pro Tem, which at that point was Peter Shumlin, and Chap Smith, the Speaker. Right. They appointed 1 member from the public, and I ended up being that member from the public. So the votes were always about 4-3. It got political, and that one was defeated on a 4-3 vote, so it didn't get in there. However, there were a couple of things that were voted for, but they didn't get into the report.
Oh.
And they didn't get into the contract. More important, they got into the report, but not into the contract.
Oh, the VSEA contract.
Right.
Oh.
Yes.
And the
One of
teachers.
those is to extend the health care benefits to the spouses of the teachers. We said no to that, I think, on about a 4-3
Right.
vote. And that's in our report. However, when the time came to negotiate that, they weren't able to get it in there.
Huh.
Interesting.
That's just
So the
that's,
spouses of teachers can
they can
they're
have
covered by
they have the
healthcare?
benefit now. Yes, that's a very expensive benefit.
Interesting. Yeah.
So that
Oh,
pushed it
see.
up. Then the other thing was interesting because what we did, we asked the joint finance and the joint fiscal committee.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, we asked the joint fiscal committee to tell us, give us some guidelines. How much should we be spending in the budget on these so-called pensions and health care benefits?
Right.
So they said, we think that they should not go up beyond the year that we were looking at, which I think at that point was like 2008, any more than 3.5% a year.
Huh.
Okay?
And this is for both pension?
Both.
Both of them?
Both. Well, believe it or not, we exceeded that. And no one has ever bothered to go back and pursue that, which I have tried, but nobody's listening because we're way over that.
Yeah.
Matter of fact, I do have one statistic that I think you would find interesting on that particular one. I think we're about 46% over that.
Well, that's a little more than 3.
We should have been at $140 million as of 2017 or 19. Instead, we're at $177 million.
So we're
This is
40
staggering.
million, a little over 40 million.
40 million, absolutely. Now
Over.
but each year we go over it. And we
Yeah.
have to go over it now because we have to pay the ARC, which is the annual required contribution to fund the unfunded liability.
Right.
Now remember, the unfunded liability is like a mortgage. A mortgage like you've never seen, I hope you don't have on your house.
Yes.
Right.
4.8
We're
billion.
beyond mortgages now,
Yeah,
Pat, right?
Exactly.
What it is you write off, in this case, $4.5 billion. You write it off over a 30-year period of time. Now keep in mind, we aren't paying anything on the mortgage for the retiree health care benefits of 2.3. So what we're paying is on the 2.2, and we're writing it off over 30 years. So, and this is a logical way, except that what happens, instead of having a level payment, you have a payment that goes up every year by 5%.
Right,
Gotcha.
Right.
Yep.
And I
Right.
think my interpretation of that is that allows for the state gaining more revenues. So if it goes up 5%, from my perspective, I'd say that they would say that, well, if revenues are going up 5%, then that's a reasonable way in which to retire it.
Right.
And what I did, I said, well, first of all, each time the unfunded liability goes up, you go back to wherever, you don't start at 30. So now we're down to 20 years. So when we had this $900 million up here, then half of that, because most of that was half and half,
Right.
that has only 20 years to amortize. So you know that's a much higher amount, and that's why we're getting much higher figures, because we have a shorter term
Right.
in which to
Oh, I see.
amortize.
Oh, I see, right. Yeah.
So, and I'll talk later on,
Yeah.
I know you're going to ask me one of
Yeah.
my solutions to this, or
Right.
possible solutions, and I'll
Well,
explain that, because I think it's an important
Where
piece
did
of
the
it.
defined contribution plan come in? Was that part of the commission's study? Not to do defined benefits, but to do defined.
That was by vote.
You sort of set Governor Douglas up, is that right?
Yeah, well, we just thought that's the only way you can limit the state's exposure.
Yeah, I agreed with you at the time.
And what's the difference between, and just for our viewers' benefit, defined benefit versus defined contribution? Because I'm not sure a whole lot of people know what.
Right, okay, the defined benefit plan is a plan that will will pay you a certain sum based on your last 3 years' salary, or 5 years, depending on which plan you're in, over your lifetime.
Set amount, every.
Set amount.
Set amount.
Set
To
amount.
the
Never change.
Oh,
employees.
no, it goes up, cost of living
Oh,
increases.
yes, I
Yeah,
apologize, that's
yeah.
right, my
Yeah,
husband
it goes
does
up
that.
that way, and then a defined contribution plan is something that you own. Okay, so the state will match whatever you pay in, or a private employer would do the same thing, and then you take that with you. If you were to die in the state as a member of this, say a teacher,
Right.
okay, then there's a limit on how much money that you're going to be able to get, period. So you won't have that benefit. You lose that benefit for that period of time after you died.
It's sort of like the stock market, the defined contribution plan. I mean, you can buy, sell, and
Yeah,
you,
well, you
you have
can-
a lot of say in what happens to the money that's
Well, that's
invested.
the other-
You can pick
yeah.
you can pick whatever you want to invest in.
Right, right.
And
right.
and so I think
And the VSEA, Governor Douglas, well, you can tell the story better than I, started to talk about it. Oh, the VSEA was just so opposed. And I thought they should have brought it to a vote, because I know I think they were selling their members short. There's a lot
Yeah.
of state employees who would be able to do this without, I mean, they're smart people. They would know how to do
I hear
this.
from a lot of them after I go on a show like this,
Yeah.
saying, "Well, we don't agree with it."
They would like the opportunity.
They would like the opportunity, and then they keep that.
Because if you know what you're doing, you can make a lot more than the defined benefit.
Right,
Because
which
that's pretty
is-
stable, conservative, I think, a little bit on the
Well, I
the
think the
investments and
number I
stuff.
saw is like 8.5% is what they're getting in an interest rate for the pension fund. Is that
I mean, the state right
The
now.
state is,
the
yeah.
state. Well, let me put that in perspective. Over the last 10 years, the average rate has been about 4.5%.
It's been pretty
Okay.
low.
In the last year, it's been about 12% or 13%.
so it averages out to?
Well, when it averages, yeah, at the end of the day, because what happens is that you have your big years, then you have your bad years, and so far in the last 10 years, we've had more bad years than good years.
Yeah,
I mean,
well-
really good years.
Except for like the last 18 months have been like gangbusters for
So,
Wall Street.
David, if they had offered this to the VSEA and say, I did a 60-40 split, because it was going to be voluntary, I
Right.
think, but Governor Douglas wanted to start it voluntary. And so if 60% stayed in the defined benefits, 40%, we'd be in an incredible shape right now,
Absolutely.
right? And maybe those people in the combined plan, the stock, they would be making money hand over fist these days.
Could I go back a little bit
Sure.
to that commission report? Because the other part that I didn't cover is the fact that we voted and agreed to the fact that to the extent it exceeded 3.5%, the annual required contribution, that it would be split between the employee and the state.
Oh,
Now, if we had done that, and that was recommended by the majority of the commission,
right.
and when I said, well, why isn't that in there? I was just told that the union wouldn't accept it. Well, I mean, there's certain things you have to accept. If we had that, we wouldn't be here today.
Right, because that liability above the 3.5% would be on.
The municipal workers,
Right.
they have something like that, okay? The state invests all the money for them. However, when there is an unfunded liability, it's then shared between the union, not the union members, and then the municipality.
Yeah, oh.
So, I mean, to me, that's a much better way to run this railroad than the one we're on right now.
Right, because it prevents you from digging that hole in the first place.
That's exactly
and
right.
Once you've dug the hole, it's the responsibility of the state to dig out of the hole.
Especially when it keeps
All-
getting dug
all the state.
quicker.
All the state.
Yeah.
Right.
So one of the questions I have, it's kind of related. So we've talked a lot about the retirement side of this. The healthcare side, they just redid the numbers last year, which is why the governor had this idea around trying to do a statewide negotiation. But really, what drove that was these new plans that were introduced for teachers in Vermont, health benefit plans, that were cheaper. And so has that had any impact on the liability, these new plans?
Not yet.
Not yet. Well,
Now,
we see that in...
We're a year behind, but it would have an impact. Now, this is mainly, though, for the teachers that are active.
Correct, yeah.
Okay, what we're talking
true.
about are the retirees.
So really, it would maybe impact in like 10 years.
Well, yeah, I think moreover, if we could have that kind of a plan melded into what we are offering for the retirees. Right now, for the most part, the retirees pay 20%, and the 80% is paid by the state.
Right,
However,
80-20.
the plans are what people call Cadillac Plans.
Yeah.
So that means it's the best of everything. And I just saw where was it the teachers? I think, or no, the state workers were complaining about they don't want generic
prescription
drugs.
Well, I have to look at the list because apparently there were even generic drugs on the list that were taken off.
Oh, okay.
So it's a little bit more complicated because I wrote on Facebook to David Bellini, we were talking about it. I said there must be generic drugs to take the place of because they're less expensive, and they do the same thing. And he said no, some of the generic drugs are off the list too. So I'd have to look into that more, but they're not happy at all.
Well, so is it an option to transition some of these teachers that are already retired and still receiving health benefits to the new plans, or are they locked into the legacy plans?
To my knowledge, they're locked into the legacy.
Don't mess
plans.
with retirees.
I'm not suggesting anything. I'm just saying.
Let me make it clear to both of you right now. I have, from day one, said I don't want to mess at all with retirees. Everything
that's
I'm
not
talking
fair.
about is not the retirees. They're set,
Yes.
okay?
Yes, because we retired based on a certain set
Oh,
of parameters.
and I don't have any problem with
Pulling
that.
the rug out from
Right,
us.
right. Well,
Yeah.
we made a promise that
Yes, we
this
did.
is what we're
Promises
going to do.
made, promises kept.
Right. It's
However, as it gets further down the line and
Yeah.
the numbers keep going up,
Right.
other states are having the same issue that we're having.
And so we're talking about current employees,
Yes.
as opposed
Yes.
because, like Pat said, people make decisions on when they're going to retire and how they're their lifestyle choices when they retire based off of a lot of these types
Oh,
of
yes.
things.
Sure.
So
What kind of income, what kind of health care coverage, you decide yes or no.
They're
So.
important.
So every year, I guess every year they make a payment to the from the general fund into this. And what is that number? I had 200 million. I don't know if that's consistent every year or what are they based out on? Because it's obviously not moving the needle.
Well, let me just put it in perspective. This is the ARC for the pensions,
Right,
the annual
right.
required contribution. In 2010, it was $70 million.
Oh,
In 2019, it's $177 million. And in 2024, which I know will be higher than this because I think I
Right.
mentioned the unpredictability of this,
right.
they have 205 that they will have to pay. Now, that's why I'm saying this is not sustainable
Right.
and it's not affordable because to the extent, well, let me give you a better example. In 2000, the budget for this year, 2019, there are $82 million coming in from all the funds in terms of new revenues. There's only 37 coming in the general fund for new revenues. I got the education fund, the transportation
Right,
fund.
right.
And of that, at least $20 million has got to be paid because of the increase in the annual required contributions.
Wow. Right off the top.
Right off the top, it comes off the top. So I'm saying, and I've told this to the speaker, I've told this to the president pro tem and some members of the appropriations, that this is not sustainable.
No.
you're going to run into a bottleneck really quick.
They
where
have already.
They have already. Well, and the struggle with this is the further you kick the can down the road, the worse the problem gets.
And at what point does it start impacting I think we have a AAA and AA, right?
Yeah, we have a AAA for 2, and we have a AA plus for 1, I think S&P. Everyone writes about this now. I went with the administration to Wall Street to visit the rating agencies. I've done it several times.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing they hone in on now is how
Sure.
are you doing with your pensions? They say pensions, now they're starting to say OPED, the retiree health care benefits, because those have got to go on the state books as of 6/30/18, this fiscal year we're in. They have to be recorded. They never had to be before.
I
It
was
was
going
a
to say, a lot of this stuff wasn't mandated to be recorded, and we changed the way, well, we were mandated to change the way we report things a couple of years ago.
Well,
and
the
that's
Government
where
Accounting
this-
Standards
yes,
Board changed
yeah.
everything. Now,
The
so
GAC.
if we missed one ARC payment, the annual required contribution, then I absolutely guarantee you we would lose our AAA rating.
Wow.
I mean, that's
Just
how
one
close
missed
this
payment.
is. Just one missed payment.
Yeah.
Because
And
we went
explain to
down
people
there.
how important
and
that
we,
is.
we went down there, we looked them in the eye and said, we're going to make all of our ARC payments. Now, we are, except that they're going up so rapidly.
We-
How are we going to get those revenues
Right.
without pushing other programs aside? That's
And
the whole
The
point.
bond rating is very important because that impacts how much we pay if we borrow money. I'm sure it does, what other stuff?
Well, it does. VSAC uses
Oh,
our bond rating.
right.
VHFA uses our bond rating. The bond bank uses our bond
Pay
rating.
attention out there.
So low-income housing,
All of
student
those things.
All be
assistance,
impacted.
everything is impacted.
Everything
by this.
is impacted, right.
So people should be paying attention.
Just pay attention.
Bottom
Well, I
line.
am, I know that, but
I have to tell you, I think I'm skipping around questions, I apologize. When I was in House GovOps, I remember after you left, they said, the state and the teachers are never going out of business. And they think, it's not like a business, pick a business that could close its doors tomorrow and be in big trouble paying off its pensions and stuff. They think because it's just gonna, we'll always have teachers and we'll always have state government.
but somebody has to pay.
Well, I know, but that's how they're thinking.
I know that. It's never
I
going to
don't
go
know
out
how-
of
what
business. You're
you
never
say
going to
to-
go bankrupt. A state can't go bankrupt.
Right. So they use that as the reason why they don't want to worry about this.
Ask
but-
Alaska about that. They
Yeah,
might, they might
right.
have a different feeling.
By the way, Alaska has a DC plan, a defined contribution plan.
Yeah.
They're still out of business.
So, actually, that's a great segue into this next question. So, what would the impact be, say, two scenarios? If we had a defined contribution plan, what would the impact be to the state finances?
Even starting
Or-
just now.
Starting
Right.
now,
Yeah.
right, as opposed to starting in
I've always
2008.
said new workers, okay?
Right,
I've always
right.
said new workers. We start there, rather, but I think as we go further into this, we have to then start moving it back. The impact would be, we would have to, right now, the state has a defined contribution plan. The union is not in it, but a lot of your
And the
administration.
exempts- I was
the
in it,
exempt.
the exempts are in it.
Right,
Okay, so
Yeah,
there's a
and I
different
took, when
benefit
I left,
structure
I
for
took
the
my
exempts.
money out and put it in an investment firm.
right. It's portable.
Yeah, it's portable. I just
which
took
is
it
the
out
great
with
part
me.
about it. And then you invest it the
well.
way you, yeah. But the impact would be, there would be a transitional cost, because we have to, as I say, we wall off the folks that are in the defined benefit plan right now. So at least all of a sudden, we can isolate that, knowing that we still will have issues going forward. However, the issues are defined just to that one group. So there's a transitional cost to get, it's going to cost a little bit more money, and they claim, I've been reading reports about, it takes about 5 years, so where it kind of balances itself back out.
And this would be undertaken by the treasurer's office, right?
It'll be undertaken by the treasurer's office. And I know that, again, part of what I thought would be a reasonable way to do this would be if we did this, transferred to a DC plan, that's a structural change. And I believe that would then allow us to go back and do a 30-year amortization all over again.
Off of the people that are still in the defined,
Yes.
Defined benefits.
defined benefit.
And here's the key to that one. I use just a conventional mortgage level payments, okay? And the 177 million I mentioned before is what we owe for 2019. That would be $140 million
Wow.
that we would then have to pay over that whole period of time using a 5% interest rate for 30 years. So see, I believe there's a way to do this, but nobody wants to listen.
And I think people these days, for some reason, are very savvy about the stock market because we're hearing about it a lot. And I don't think the union's given the membership credit because I think those people can handle this.
Well, and there's supportability too. I mean, there's certainly, you know, and it kind of makes sense why the exempts would,
Yeah, 'cause
would
sometimes
have
you're there for
portability.
2 years.
Because a lot of them are there for 2
Yeah,
years in the
yeah.
exempt positions. You typically see more long-term employees in the agencies, they're not department heads.
Right,
The department
right.
heads seem to rotate fairly regularly, but people who have been, in AHS or in
Right.
Agency of Natural Resources or do those types of jobs tend to be there for a longer period of time than some of the
But you can
exempt
do very
positions.
well running your own portfolio.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, that's what
well,
a
this
lot of
year in
people-
particular, you
Yeah,
could definitely
exactly.
do pretty well.
Now, a couple of years ago, not so good,
right.
Yeah, right.
but that's the risk you take.
That's the risk you take. Right now, the state has that risk for everybody.
Right.
Right, right.
So, and what if we went to something like a 60-40 split or a 70-30 split? I know the governor was talking about this last year in
Yeah.
terms of teachers' health care. If we went to something like that with everyone,
That
what
would be
look
a
like?
huge help. And the other side of this, of course, is that this is what you have in the private sector.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
80-20 is not the customary
No,
plan
right,
anymore.
No,
And they aren't Cadillac Plans anymore.
no.
Well, and healthcare is a lot more expensive.
It sure is.
Yeah.
But I must say though, some of those, what do they call them? The emergency plans, the catastrophic plans.
Catastrophic.
They're pretty scary.
Yeah, oh
So
yeah.
you need something a little bit closer to the Cadillac for most people.
But
Because they
it
don't
allow-
have $20,000 sitting
Right,
around.
but it does allow those people that are willing, younger people are willing to take that risk. I
Right,
mean,
right.
that's something they may want to do.
Right,
Right.
and that's in some cases a more acceptable risk to some. There's your chances of having a major surgery if you're under 40 is relatively low,
Low.
and
Yeah.
so sometimes you might want to take that risk.
But that's like one day in the hospital.
Yeah,
Right, right, yeah.
Exactly. Wipe
But
you right out.
you mentioned, we're talking about retiree health care benefits, but it's interesting because I think, as I said at the outset, we aren't paying a penny against this unfunded liability.
Right.
So that means it has to increase. When I said it's $2.3 billion as of 2017, 6/30, the actuary went ahead and looked at what it will be at the end of 2018. It's going to be 2.5, almost 2.6. So it has to go up.
It's going up at a
because
fairly
we're
big
paying
clip.
nothing
Because
against
we're paying
it.
nothing against
And
it.
this
yeah.
year we should have paid $85 million.
Well,
Okay?
and
Now where do you
worse-
get that money from?
Right. And the worst is not only are we not paying against the liability, my understanding is we're still not fully funding our current liability. Right. So we have this unfunded
No, we are.
liability. We are
We are.
funding.
We're
okay.
we use the pay-as-you-go formula,
Right.
which says all of the costs incurred as well as the administrative expenses are paid. But we don't put that extra amount away so that we then have enough money in that fund when the people retire, so we don't have to raise that level way beyond what it
Is there
normal.
regulation,
Gotcha.
federal regulation that, because I know in like for
Yeah.
health insurance companies, they have to have a certain amount of money held aside in case a disaster happens and they have to pay out all these plans. Is there something guiding the
Not to
pen-
my knowledge,
Really?
no.
Huh.
No.
So there's no risk of us being in jeopardy with
I don't think
legally?
so. What we were in trouble with is years ago, and I think you remember this, Pat, we were taking the money to pay the pension. Okay, the retiree
Right.
pay-as-you-go health care benefits
Right.
out of the pension plan.
Yep,
Now, that was
that was
that's
bad. I
that you
remember that.
can't do.
Yeah,
So we corrected that. Again, the treasurer took charge of that and did a great job getting
Right.
that all straightened out.
So on that topic of this ballooning issue, because it keeps compounding every year.
It does.
2010, this is both the healthcare and pension obligation, $2.6 billion in 2010. 2016, it was $3.6 billion, so it had gone up $1 billion between 2010 and
Right.
2016.
That was a good year.
That was a good year, but within
good.
between 2016 and 2017, we're up to 4.5 billion. So almost another billion just in
Yeah.
between 16 and 17. Definitely seems like it's accelerating.
Well, let me tell you why this goes up. And it all goes back to the beginning. Everything goes back to the beginning. And when these things were negotiated with the unions, they obviously didn't use realistic assumptions.
right.
Okay, people are living longer now than they did then. We estimated that the costs, like the medical costs, were going to stay at a
Right.
certain level, maybe a 3% increase, and we know
Well,
we
that
had
was an error.
double-digit increases.
It's more like 8 or 9%
Yeah, right.
increases.
And they always estimated we were going to make, I think, as far back as I go, 8.5% per year, compounded essentially,
Right.
on all of our investments. And I just mentioned, over the last 10 years, we've only made 4.5%. So there's a huge gap right there.
Right.
And the fact that people live longer, those are all accelerating this. And now we have better assumptions that were being made, but the one glaring one that we haven't changed is on the rate of return, the interest rate
Right.
that we
Right.
get on our investments. The Treasury reduced this from almost 8, it was 7.95 or something, 8% down to 7.5%. So that caused some of that $900 million. However, we haven't done that before.
Right.
This year is an exception, but we aren't going to continue that very long. And if we were to only generate 6.5% return, which some people would argue on that, some people say you can never project more than 5.5%. Just 6.5%, that's another $600 million that's just waiting there.
Wow.
That we're going to have to add to the 4.5.
But I think when I used to sit on the state employees pension
Oh, yes,
committee
that would
for-
have to be
for
interesting.
years, and because I was commissioner of personnel, and they always wanted the treasurer to be conservative.
Yeah.
And that's you
Right.
have to think about
'Cause
things.
you'd
Do you
rather
want her
have
to
a
be
surplus than
conservative
a-
or
Yeah.
or take some risks, because you can't take risks with state money. But that would help here if there was a little higher return on investment.
Well, the biggest retirement system in the country is CalPERS, California, and they're at 7%.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we have to get it
Yeah,
at least to
yeah.
7%.
And CalPERS actually does some pretty unique things with their healthcare benefits, and they've actually kind of been a leader in the U.S. in terms of ways to reduce healthcare liability. They've tried some pretty unique things, such as like reference pricing and things like that, to try to keep the cost of healthcare lower.
Oh, healthcare.
And they've been relatively successful in that, because that's where a lot of the driving factor is. I mean, we talked a little bit here about
It's all healthcare.
half of it is healthcare now, and that's the part that's growing the fastest right now, and that's the most difficult to predict.
And ours is growing the fastest as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, it's interesting, I wrote, most states, nobody's at 100% funded. So what's
We
the-
were several years ago, believe it or
But
not.
I think the norm is, what is the norm, 92, 90, I mean, something even
well,
lower
I
than
mean,
that?
Right now, just the state workers, they're at 74%.
Right.
And the teachers are at about 54%. So I always put everything together, because the total liability is the total liability.
Yeah.
We can't separate
Right.
it. So the average then is about 61%. That's low.
That's low.
It's pretty low.
So what are the states that are doing well, how high are they?
Well, they're 80%.
80,
Yeah, yeah. And 80% in the private sector is good. Just because it's almost required by the IRS and the SEC. If it gets below that, you have to notify the employees.
Oh,
So
really?
they don't want you to do that. And they use different discount rates. So they have a lot more pressure than we do at the state level. I mean, their discount rates, just to give you an example, we're using 7.5%. They have to use about 4.4, I think was the last one.
Wow.
So that's a huge difference. So that means a low discount rate means it's a higher liability.
Right.
And a high discount rate means a lower liability. That's why the 7.5,
Right.
if it was 6.5, we would have to add another $600 million.
Right, and they've got to be exceeding that, a 4.5% or a 5% fairly regularly, I would imagine, in their investment portfolios.
They should.
Yeah.
But you got to remember, now this is, again, in fairness, you have, I think it's like about $3.6 billion that we have in investments. And we don't have it all in equity. We don't have it all in bonds. We don't have it all in other. We have about a third, and a third. So even when that market goes way up, like it has been,
Right, it's still only a
It's
third.
still
it's only a third of the
right?
total. And then we have international equity, and real estate. So you have to really
Right.
spread it out to be conservative, because you aren't going to
Well,
try to hit the home run.
Well, you've got to balance it out.
You
If
got to
one goes
balance it out.
down,
If
the
it's
other
all in
one's gotta-
equity,
right.
then you're in trouble, because we're
Because you're in it for the long haul.
right.
Right.
You're in it for the long haul, and we had slow recovery growth out of this last recession, but the last 2 years have been pretty fast growth, so it's great. But the problem with that is we're more than 10 years out from the last recession, and we know there's another one probably coming.
Yeah, because that's an ebb and flow thing
It's
too,
an ebb and
right?
flow thing
Right.
too.
It's bound to come.
Yeah, so it's great in the up years,
Just
not so
when,
great in
not
the down
if.
years.
I just want people to know, if you want to read some of the things that David has written, I went on VT Digger, and you just put your name in, David Coates, and all this stuff comes
Don't
up.
read the comments.
No.
Yeah.
Whoa, yes, I was going to say, I was like, whoa. But going back 2012, 2014, every year you have written these op-eds, and with pretty startling headlines, state pension woes become municipal woes, that we're underfunding, and it just goes on and on. And
Dangerous trends.
well,
I think I
yeah,
started
the
with that
latest one
I
was
think I saw that
more
headline.
bad pension news for Vermonters. That's this year's. And I honestly, David, I honestly don't understand why they don't get this. I really don't. What is it? Because there's money's hard to come by, and they've got to meet other needs, and they're just hoping to keep pushing it off. Because someday this is going to blow up. Is
Well,
it
I
not?
think it's blowing up.
Oh,
And as long as the governor stays where he is, I think that puts more pressure on appropriations
Right.
because they have to live within a budget.
but he said
Right.
next year he's interested. He'll listen to tax increases.
Well, and I think, and I believe this anyway, I think that if they were to put a tax on Vermonters, taxpayers, to pay for these liabilities, I think you would see a huge change in the legislature. That's my feeling.
I think so too.
You think the gun
We
people?
don't
You
wanna
think the
pay for
the
this.
gun people got mad? You watch.
I think you're probably right, because I think
Yeah.
there's a distinct difference in saying, I've seen this in the paid family leave debate, right? Is this is a new tax, but it's going to fund this program, and we can have a debate about that. Is this tax worth what the benefit that we're going to get from funding this program? And you don't have that debate in this case.
Here's what we owe. How
Here's
do
what
pay
we
for it?
owe. We owe this because we mismanaged the funds, or because of X, Y, and Z, or whatever. And you're going to ask Vermonters to pay more for that. And I
Especially
think they're
since
not
we've
going to take
known-
kindly to that.
We've known about this for what, since 2009,
Well,
if not before.
Well, and actually, this is a good question, because there are other unfunded liabilities in state government. The biggest one that comes to my mind, and we can talk about what the mandate is behind this, but water quality funding.
Yeah.
Right.
And we're
Oh,
looking at
my
60
God.
to $75 million a
Yeah.
year for the next 20 years. That's a 1.2
We've had
to
several
1.5
shows on
billion.
that. It's
Yeah.
a passion of
Well,
ours.
A $1.5 billion liability.
These are all competing interests.
right.
Yeah.
And we have no funding mechanism.
No,
for
not at
that.
this point.
Not at this point. And and I'm sure that there are definitely other ones.
And this state would not fare well if that lake gets any
Right.
worse, because
Oh, no.
it's a huge economic driver, Lake Champlain,
I-
and all of our waterways. for
I
that
know it
matter.
well. I live on
Yeah,
it.
I was
yes, you
going to
do.
say you have
Couple
where
of
it
You
is.
see it every
Yeah,
day.
exactly. This not only
So we do
impacts you.
everything we can. One thing that I think will maybe bring this forward would be the fact that we have now got agreement between the administration and the treasurer, and really the board that you were on, I think.
Yeah, the pension,
The
yeah.
pension board, to have a stress test.
Oh, you have to talk about that, because I actually didn't know. I understood sort of the concept, but
Right. I mean,
you
this
pushed
is
for that,
this
right?
is very interesting. Yeah, I've been pushing for it just because we needed an outside source. I don't even get invited to testify anymore. They didn't want to hear from me again.
Well, here
It's
you
only
are. They'll
bad
listen to you
news.
now.
And the outside source will then take a look at our pension and our OPED to see whether or not they're sustainable, given the state's finances, okay, and that path they're on, and we're looking at a path of 3 to 3.5% max, okay, and revenue increase.
Yeah, right.
And then they look at the fact that we haven't had a recession, it's a decade now,
Right. Yeah, we're
and you
We do.
also
We
have,
do.
within that, you have this volatility periodically.
Right.
Like we've had it in the last couple of years.
Right.
So all of those things come into play, and I call it the affordability piece. And this is what Vermonters need to hear, and I think the legislature needs to hear. Can we afford these plans?
Whoa.
And if we can't, then what are the alternatives? Now, that's being conducted this year, I understand, and the administration and Beth and Suzanne Young, they've negotiated that, and they'll both be part of it. And I think this will really be telling at the end of the day, because it's going to be clear, from my perspective, that
We're in
we
trouble.
can afford them if,
Yeah.
okay? And then what is the if?
right.
Is the if is we change them, or is the if we raise money to pay them, which seems to be the preferred method of, I hate to say it, the union, I don't hate to say it,
No.
but I am saying it's the union
Yeah.
and those legislators that rely on the union for support. That's our problem in the state of
But
Vermont.
this might be the time to change to the defined contribution, maybe.
It could be part of that, or we could
Relieve
have
it a
them.
little.
We could have them pay in more money. That's another way.
Yep.
They're a hybrid plan, which you can have a piece of this and a piece of that. There's a cash balance. There's all kinds of different things.
Yeah.
However, we got to get it sustainable and affordable.
Now, they've picked somebody to do this stress test?
They're using the same firm that has done the actuarial work, and the reason why I'm okay with that is because they have a good record,
Oh, good.
and they only came in this last year. They're brand new to the state.
Oh,
So they
okay.
don't have any history here, that's
And
good.
and then the treasurer's office and the administration are working together to drive what are they going to be doing.
Good.
Okay, and they'll be monitoring it periodically. So I feel it'll be fair.
And when is all of this due to be
Well,
reported back?
I certainly wanted it before Election Day.
I don't know if they want it before Election
I was gonna say,
Day.
you want to bet it's going to be a little after.
They might be like, 2 weeks later.
December
by
1st.
the time
So
actually.
it'll be full speed ahead, and they have all the data. That's the other thing. The Pew Foundation wanted to come in and do it, and they've got a good track record
Right.
too. However, they don't have a good record with the unions.
Ah,
And I understand that if we can't go in there with somebody that
right,
one party doesn't have confidence in.
right.
Right.
So that's
That's the whole thing that makes it work, right? Is everyone has to have confidence in the outcome.
Yes,
So,
yes.
David, we have 11 minutes, and I certainly want to get to the recommendation part of this, but you had talked about the impact of all of this on the budget, the CAFR, I mean, this whole laundry list of ripple effect that this.
Well, yeah, let me
that this
talk a little
has.
bit, if I can, about
Yeah.
what happens on CAFRA, which is our state's financial statements.
Right,
If we took a look at June 30, which just ended, we had a net worth, the difference between the assets and the liabilities, we had a net worth of $1.2 million. That's not a lot.
No.
Okay? However, if we take a look at what the 1.2 billion, I'm sorry.
billion, I was like, what, we're in trouble.
However, we do not have on the financial statements as of June 30, 17, the retiree health care benefits, not all of them. So there's almost $2 billion more. So when you look
Oh.
at that, we have someplace between a $2 and a $400 million deficit, which means if you were going to the bank, okay, and said, I want to get a loan on this house, they're going to say, forget it because you're bankrupt, okay? You have more liabilities than you have assets.
Right.
And
yeah.
this is the state, we will be in
Right.
next year, and I've had people other than myself. I'm
Is
just
Doug Hoffer, because he seems to be pretty astute, we've had him on the show too.
I don't think he's been paying any attention to this.
Right, because
I-
he's
I-
just auditing the CAFR
Yeah.
to make sure that.
Yeah. Oh no, it
Right,
doesn't
but
ha-
when something's missing of the CAFR.
no, it's not missing.
It's not.
It's right.
It's
the
not
CAFR
included.
is done right. It's just that it doesn't have to be. It's not mandated
oh, I
until
see.
this year
Oh, I'm
coming.
sorry.
No,
Okay.
no. Doug is
Okay.
fine. He's,
Yeah,
he's a
'cause I
good
like
auditor.
Doug. Yeah,
he's a good auditor.
guy.
It's interesting. So, you've been up in the legislature testifying. I know I've seen at least 2 or 3 of your
Right.
PowerPoints up there. You've always packed the room.
Well, mainly union members.
But what's the reaction been? Like, what do people tell you afterward? And what has anything happened?
We
Well,
do that sky is falling
First of all,
ad.
can I say that I'm a Democrat?
You can say that,
Okay,
we
I'm a
like that
Democrat.
on this
I'm
show.
a registered Democrat. However, a conservative Democrat fiscally. So this is the kind of thing that I see really being a problem for our children, our grandchildren. You're going to have to face it. And I think a lot of older people are leaving the state. We know that.
Yes.
That's another topic.
Yeah.
However, I think the reaction I'm getting, I hear from Democrats and Republicans, but I hear from a lot of Democrats saying, stay on it, stay on it. I've heard from union members
Right.
that have said, we had a conference at Champlain College last October, and the union member came up to me and said, Mr. Coates, keep it up, keep it up. We have to face reality.
Right.
So people
But the
understand it.
union was advertising it like the sky is falling, Chicken Little, sky is falling.
Who's Chicken Little?
They had his picture
That might
on
be-
a chicken.
How did I not see
Yeah,
that?
I have to send it to
But
you.
I take that as a compliment.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, they're listening at least.
Well,
They don't
I'm
want to
getting
hear
their
it, but
they
they're
don't want to
listening.
hear it.
So what is the worst case scenario? Like if we don't meet our obligations, or we have to meet them and we have to make change. What's the worst case scenario?
Okay, the worst case, and let me, first of all, I want to make sure I didn't cover this, and I should have, and that is if we continued making these payments, even though they go up to over
Right,
$200 million, in the year 2038, we'll all be paid off. We'll owe zero,
Oh.
except for what we accumulate from going forward, at least 600 million more. It'll all be paid off. That's
Oh.
the good news.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm saying, if we remortgage, okay, re-amortize, go
Right.
back to 30 years, you pay more interest that way, but we make it affordable.
Yes.
So
Yeah, that
what'll
makes sense.
happen is that they'll have to raise taxes. There's no other way we can get around this without raising taxes. And what's the big tax? They aren't going to do a sales tax.
That's going to be
Property,
It'll be an income tax.
yeah.
And,
So-
you know, most people would say we're taxed out. And I don't think many people would disagree, particularly now with the changes at the federal level.
Right, right.
So that's the worst case. And I think, I mentioned it earlier, I don't think the taxpayers in the state of Vermont are going to stand for it. And you talk about people leaving the state, you won't be able to count them fast enough. You'll have to put a blockade down there, okay?
Southern
Brattleboro
border.
and
Well,
Bennington.
it's because
I mean, they're going to be flying.
We're
out
going to be
there.
building our own wall to keep people
David
in.
said 2009. If we did it then, it would have been 20 years and almost done by now.
It would have, well,
Right?
it would have
20
been.
years.
However, we had to also face the reality that we had bad assumptions then too.
Oh, I
Right.
see.
Yep.
We couldn't
Right,
live up to
right,
all of our assumptions. And so I think we're going to do better with the new group. But that's the worst case scenario,
Well,
in my opinion.
let's look forward to
now,
that report.
we can't not pay them.
Right.
Now-
so do not, not funding the liability really is not an option.
Yeah, but I want to make sure we're clear, though, on the retiree health care benefits. We're not funding that at all. So that means if it kept running
But
out
we're
the way it
self-funded,
does,
so they're paying it as they expense it.
the 40-some-odd $1,000 or $1 million we're paying now for retiree health care benefits, that would probably go up to $200 million.
Ooh.
Okay?
Okay.
I mean, but it's going to go up it has to go up that far because we aren't putting any money away.
Right.
And so, to me, we have to do something. Now, what happens with that? If you can't pay something, you can't afford it, why do you have it? I mean, it's a great perk.
Yeah, oh.
Again, retirees,
Thank you.
people are close to retirement, that shouldn't be an issue.
Yep.
However, we've got to stop it. And all I'm saying is, well, my goodness,
'Cause
can't we
it's a
stop it for
great
new?
benefit.
Can't we stop it for new employees?
Right. So we
And
start
then-
phasing it out.
Start phasing it out, and then, as I said, it would be about 12% of the workforce right now would be on a defined contribution plan or wouldn't have retiree health care benefits.
Right.
I mean, that's a huge step.
Yeah.
But
We're one of the very few employers who do that too. Nobody does healthcare after
Healthcare
retirement.
after
Nobody.
retirement,
Who
well,
does
you
that?
pay 20%,
Yeah.
but that's a pittance.
Oh, that,
Yeah.
and
You know,
really,
compared to
twice
what
a
the
year
ba-
is
the
$400 or
benefits are.
$500. I'm like,
Right.
sign that check.
Yeah, I mean, I'm struggling to think of a private sector employer that would do that.
They don't.
Yeah.
Nobody does it.
They aren't doing it anymore. They
No.
used to do it, and I was with some of those, and they paid 100%. But
Wow.
the cost
But
has
the
gone
cost
up
has
so
gone
much.
up so
Yeah, we
much.
have to ask David for, I'm worried about the time, for your recommendations of how to get out of this, and I think you've covered some
I
of them.
think we've covered all
Yeah,
of
you've
them.
covered.
I do think we need to convert new employees to a defined contribution plan and wall off the other liabilities that we've accumulated. I do think that we need to do the same thing for retiree health care benefits, take them off it.
Can I ask you, is there any time where you would have to take all that money and pay it all out?
Not at one time, no.
Which is why they look at it now that it's just being paid off as it's expended. I go to the hospital, I put my bill in.
Right.
So,
It's just that those payments keep going way up. I
That's
mean,
true.
$85 million a year, this last year, we should have put into that fund to make it a fund that could make its payments when
Right.
required, okay?
Right.
A sustainable fund, and we aren't doing it. We're doing it for the pensions, but we
but
aren't
not the
doing it for
OPEB.
that.
For healthcare.
To me,
Yeah.
that's the big elephant in the room.
So, does that, we were talking about teachers' health care and pension benefits in particular. Do you think that that is an income tax liability? Because typically that would be a general fund thing. Or do you think it should be on the education fund?
Well, I think it is education.
Right.
And some of it is taken out of there now anyway. I think about maybe up to $10 million. So
Yeah, so the non-funded.
okay.
Right, so the non-funded piece is still general fund
I
liability.
mean, it's true cost of education, and you
Right.
should have it all in one category. I mean, the state never should have taken it on when they did, but it wasn't expensive then.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Sounds like a great idea. And I think 10 million from the tobacco money was put in against us. But what I
10
said,
million in
I
a-
said to David, I said
yeah.
it's like a grain of sand on the beach.
I love it.
You know, what does that do?
Well, I made that argument about the governor's, 20 million with the teachers' health care thing. Like 20 million in a 1.6 billion dollar fund is like
Really.
Speck of sand.
It's-
I love
it's-
it.
Yeah, it's a drop in the bucket. I
Yeah.
mean, and are you really going to expend this much energy?
But it
over
was a feel-good thing, and it saved a lot of interest. Well, at the end of the day, it doesn't amount to very much when you're looking at 2.3 billion.
Right.
If you were to run that through the whole 30 years, it would be like more like 5 billion, including interest.
Right. Yeah.
That number just staggers me, really. When Tom Pelham told me that, I just about lost it. Billion. I mean,
Yeah.
and that billion's been around for a lot of years. It's just
Well, it's the
adding to it.
It's the biggest liability we have on our balance
Right.
sheet. I mean, when you
Yeah.
put that on our balance sheet, everything else seems small, including our bonded indebtedness.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we have other liabilities like Medicaid and Medicare, which
Well,
are
but we don't have to book those, okay?
right because they're
We
largely
fund,
federal.
we fund those annually. But this we aren't funding.
Right.
Well, very
Scary.
complicated. We will certainly help get the word out.
I appreciate that.
Really. Is there anything that we haven't covered? I think I'm very impressed with all
we-
your numbers.
I
You don't
think
even
we-
look.
Well, I think we probably covered about everything I can possibly think of that is relevant. And I think the important part of this also is that we have to keep paying the ARC and for the pensions to keep
Yep.
our bond rating.
Right.
And if we
Yeah,
lose that
that's
bond
scary.
rating, I'm telling you, that's going to cost millions of dollars.
Well, that's
Yeah.
scary. I didn't realize that it was connected to VSAC and to the
Yeah, the
Vermont
housing.
Housing Coalition.
Bond Bank.
Bond Bank.
Bond Bank has more
It's-
than anyone. I think Bond Bank has probably got about 800 million.
And that's scary because there's a lot of people that rely on those affordable housing
Right.
loans and on
Cool.
VSAC
Yeah,
loans.
But look
VSAC.
at the bond bank. All our municipalities rely on it.
That's right.
yeah, yeah,
So,
exactly.
I mean, that's just.
You're talking infrastructure projects and all of that.
Yeah.
Thank you all for tuning in. We'll see you next week, and we want to give a special thanks to David Coates. This has been quite interesting and a little scary, David. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pat.
Thank you.
Thank
so
you,
much.
Ben.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll see you next week.